One night, she dared to speak. "Daddy, it hurts. It hurts," she whispered, her small voice trembling. Marco ignored her words, his gaze hard and unyielding. When he left, she lay in bed, clutching her pillow, tears soaking her cheeks. In the quaint town of Mbuna, little Lila's laughter was a melody everyone loved. At only 7 years old, she had a vibrant spirit, her days filled with imagination, laughter, and the endless curiosity of childhood. Her days were often spent drawing, singing to her dolls, or pretending to be a queen in a far-off kingdom. Her father, Marco, worked from home, while her mother, Eva, owned a thriving boutique in the city. Every evening, Eva would come home, always in a rush to close her day's accounts, barely sparing a glance at her daughter's wide-eyed stories about her day. One evening, as Lila was arranging her little dollhouse, Marco entered her room, his face shadowed in the dim light. He closed the door gently behind him, his expression unusually serious. "Lila, I want to teach you something very special," he said, his voice low and calm. "But remember, this is a secret. You must never tell anyone." Lila looked at him, confused, but her father's tone made her feel she should trust him. He was her dad, after all. With a hesitant nod, she whispered, "Okay, Daddy. I won't tell." As the days passed, Marco's visits to Lila's room became more frequent, and each time, Lila grew increasingly fearful. She didn't understand why she felt uncomfortable, she only knew that something was wrong. She wanted to tell her mother, but Marco's words echoed in her mind, reminding her of the secret they shared. The moment of silence between them felt heavy, and though she couldn't fully understand, her heart ached with the confusion that words couldn't express. One night, she dared to speak. "Daddy, it hurts," she whispered, her small voice trembling. Marco ignored her words, his gaze hard and unyielding. When he left, she lay in bed, clutching her pillow, tears soaking her cheeks. Her innocence was crumbling under a weight she didn't yet know how to carry. In the darkness, she whispered to herself, "I want it to stop. I don't want to be special anymore." Eva was ambitious, driven by her dreams of expanding her boutique. She spent her days surrounded by fabrics and customers, thriving in the hustle of her city shop. In her mind, she was providing a future for her family, giving Lila a better life than she ever had. That night, as she counted her day's earnings at the dining table, Lila approached her hesitantly. "Mommy," she began, her voice a tiny whisper, "I need to tell you something," but Eva, without looking up, sighed. "Lila, please, can't you see I'm busy? Go play." Disheartened, Lila nodded and returned to her room, her hope slipping away, one ignored moment at a time. Lila's attempts to tell her mother continued, each one met with the same indifferent response. The fear and loneliness inside her grew, and each night, her room felt colder. Every time Marco visited, she would close her eyes tightly, praying it would stop, wishing for someone, anyone, to save her. She started to dread the evenings, her once beloved room now a prison filled with shadows. When she tried to tell her mother again, Eva was in the middle of organizing her boutique inventory. "Mommy, it hurts," when Daddy, Lila's words faltered as Eva waved her off. "Stop being dramatic, Lila," she snapped. "I have work to do." Lila's heart sank, and she knew there was no one who would listen to her. She would have to carry this pain alone. As the days turned into weeks, Lila's laughter disappeared. Her once bright eyes became hollow, and her friends at school began to notice her withdrawn nature. Tara, her closest friend, asked her one day, "Lila, are you okay? You don't play with us anymore." Lila managed a small, forced smile. "I'm okay, Tara, just tired." But even as she spoke, her voice quivered, the weight of her secret pressing down on her. In her room that night, Lila whispered to herself, "Why doesn't anyone see? Why doesn't anyone care?" She felt a loneliness that words couldn't describe, her trust in the world eroding. She started to fear bedtime, the creak of the floorboards, the quiet footsteps approaching her door. Her once safe world was now a terrifying nightmare, one she was helpless to escape. One afternoon, Eva sat at the dining table, balancing her sales ledger, when Lila approached her once more. "Mommy," she started, her voice barely audible, "why does Daddy come into my room when you're not here?" Eva sighed, her patience wearing thin. "Lila, stop with the stories. You're always trying to get attention. Your father works hard for us, and you should be grateful." Lila's heart broke as her mother's harsh words struck her like a blow. "But Mommy, it hurts," she managed, her voice cracking. Eva looked up sharply. "Lila, enough," she snapped, slamming her pen down. "If you're not happy here, maybe you should stay somewhere else." Lila's words froze on her lips, the last flicker of hope extinguished. She turned and walked back to her room, her mother's words echoing in her mind. She was alone, utterly alone. With nowhere left to turn, Lila withdrew further into herself. She stopped trying to talk, stopped hoping for her mother's attention. She no longer tried to escape Marco's nightly visits, resigning herself to a life of pain and silence. Her world became a cold, dark place, where every whisper, every plea, went unheard. One evening, as she lay in bed, she whispered to the darkness, "Why does no one care? Why won't anyone help me?" But the silence that answered her only deepened her despair. She began to wonder if she was invisible, if her pain was something no one could see. The innocence of her childhood had been stolen, replaced by a constant fear that shadowed her every step. One evening, Eva's sister, Nina, came to visit. Nina was sharp and perceptive, quick to notice the sadness in Lila's eyes. "Lila, are you happy here?" Nina asked gently. Lila glanced up, her lips trembling as she searched Nina's face. "Aunt Nina, what would you do if something bad happened?" Nina's eyes softened, sensing the pain behind her niece's words. "Lila, honey, you can tell me anything," she whispered, reaching for Lila's hand. But before Lila could speak, Marco entered the room, his gaze icy. "Lila, it's bedtime," he said, his voice cold. Lila glanced at Nina one last time, her hope slipping away again as she retreated into the shadows. Nina couldn't shake the uneasy feeling Lila's words had left in her heart. Later that night, she approached Eva, concern etched on her face. "Eva, I'm worried about Lila. She seems withdrawn, almost scared," she said carefully. Eva laughed, brushing off her sister's concerns. "Lila's just going through a phase. She's a bit dramatic, that's all. You know kids," she replied dismissively. But Nina's intuition wouldn't let her rest. "Eva, sometimes children's stories aren't just stories. Maybe there's something she's trying to tell you." Eva rolled her eyes. "Nina, please, you're overthinking. Lila is perfectly fine." Nina's heart ached as she looked at her sister's indifference. She resolved to keep a closer watch, feeling that something was deeply, painfully wrong. As the weeks continued, Nina visited frequently, watching Lila closely. She noticed the dark circles under her niece's eyes, the way she flinched whenever Marco was near. Despite her sister's pleas, Eva refused to see the signs right before her eyes. She was convinced that Lila was simply seeking attention, and her mind was too absorbed in her business to entertain what she considered childish whims. Meanwhile, Marco's nighttime visits continued, each one chipping away at Lila's spirit. She had stopped struggling, stopped crying out, her young heart broken by betrayal and neglect. One night, as the house lay silent, Lila lay awake in bed, her body tense, her small frame curled tightly beneath the blankets. She stared at the door, knowing that any moment it would creak open, and her father would be standing there. She wanted to scream, but the fear and the memories of her mother's dismissals held her silent. Instead, she buried her face in her pillow, wishing for the night to end quickly. But before she could fall into the safety of sleep, the door opened. Marco entered quietly, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "My special girl," he whispered as he approached, his voice thick with an affection that felt tainted and wrong. Lila shut her eyes tightly, wishing she could disappear, willing her mind to drift away from her reality. Each minute felt like an eternity until finally, the nightmare ended, and Marco left her room, leaving her in darkness. The next morning, Eva noticed a strange stillness about Lila. She sat at the breakfast table, her spoon idle in her cereal, her eyes downcast. "Lila, eat your breakfast," Eva said briskly as she prepared to leave for her boutique. But Lila didn't respond. Her small frame seemed to shrink under her mother's gaze, and she looked like a ghost of herself. "Lila," Eva repeated, this time with a hint of irritation. When her daughter finally looked up, Eva saw a flash of something in her eyes, a deep, hollow emptiness that seemed out of place in a 7-year-old. Eva frowned, but before she could say anything more, her phone buzzed with a business call, snapping her out of the moment. "I'll see you tonight, Lila." "Be good," she said absent-mindedly, heading out the door and leaving her daughter alone once again. As the door closed, Lila felt a weight settle over her. She had tried to find solace in her mother's presence, but once again, she had been abandoned to face her pain alone. She sat there, staring at her untouched breakfast, wondering if she would ever escape the silent prison her life had become. That night, Lila sat alone in her room, clutching a small teddy bear close to her chest. She wished she could tell Aunt Nina everything, but fear held her captive. She had tried to speak out before, and each time she was silenced. She glanced at her door, dreading the familiar creak that signaled Marco's approach. A week later, Nina returned, determined to confront Eva. She couldn't ignore the signs any longer. "Eva, I think you're turning a blind eye to something serious," Nina said, her voice sharp. "There's something wrong, and I'm certain it involves Marco. Lila's terrified of him, can't you see it?" Eva bristled, anger flaring in her eyes. "Nina, I'm done with your accusations. Marco is a good father, and Lila is simply going through a rough phase. I trust my husband." Nina's shoulders sagged, but she refused to back down. "Eva, if you don't listen now, you may regret it forever," she said, her voice filled with desperation. But Eva shook her head, unwilling to see the truth. The following day, fate intervened. Eva returned home earlier than usual, her meeting cancelled unexpectedly. As she entered the house, she heard muffled sounds coming from upstairs, a faint whimper, followed by hurried shuffling. Her heart pounded as she climbed the stairs, every step filled with a growing sense of dread. She reached Lila's door and froze, listening. Inside, Marco's voice was low and menacing. "Remember, you promised not to tell anyone. This is our secret." Eva's mind raced, and without another thought, she flung the door open, her eyes falling on the horrifying scene. Marco jerked back, surprise flashing across his face, but the damage was already done. Eva's world shattered in that instant. Her mind reeled, piecing together every ignored plea, every dismissed story, every time she had turned away from Lila. She stared at her husband, horror etched on her face. "Marco, what? How could you?" Her voice broke, a mixture of rage and disbelief flooding her heart. But Marco remained silent, his expression unrepentant. Eva turned to Marco, her hands shaking with fury. You monster," she screamed, her voice echoing through the house. "How could you do this to our daughter? She's just a child." Marco's face remained stoic, but his eyes flickered with something cold and distant. "You were never around, Eva," he said quietly, his words dripping with resentment. "You were too busy with your work to notice anything. That's no excuse." Eva's voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. I trusted you with her. I trusted you. She fell to her knees, wrapping her arms around Laya, who clung to her mother as if she were a lifeline. With shaking hands, Eva picked up her phone and called the authorities. Her voice was choked with emotion, but she managed to explain what had happened. Within minutes, the police arrived, and Marco was taken into custody, his face devoid of any remorse. As they led him away, he looked back at Eva, his gaze filled with bitterness. You did this, he muttered, but she couldn't bear to look at him anymore. Eva held Laya close, her heart breaking for all the pain her daughter had endured. She couldn't escape the guilt that suffocated her, and more than anything, she feared that Laya would never be able to forgive her. Laya, meanwhile, was placed in counseling, where she began to unearth the weight of the trauma she had carried alone for so long. In the small, warmly lit office of her therapist, Mrs. Ose, Laya found a safe space. Mrs. Ose's gentle voice and patient gaze reassured her that, here, she could finally speak without fear. For the first few sessions, Laya was silent, fidgeting with her fingers, her eyes darting around the room. But slowly, through soft words and quiet understanding, Mrs. Ose coaxed out the darkness that had filled Laya's heart. Eva would sit in the waiting room, her hands wringing as she waited for Laya to emerge. She longed to comfort her daughter, to bridge the chasm that had formed between them, but every time she looked into Laya's eyes, she saw the betrayal reflected back at her. It tore at her soul, and she wondered if their relationship would ever be whole again. One evening, after another counseling session, Eva sat on Laya's bed, watching her daughter as she arranged her dolls in neat rows. Laya barely glanced at her, focusing intently on her tiny dolls, each one a symbol of the innocence she had lost. Eva cleared her throat, her voice trembling. Laya, I know I wasn't there for you, and I can't tell you how sorry I am. Laya stopped and looked up, her young face filled with a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a pain too heavy for her years. Why didn't you believe me, Mommy? She whispered, her words cutting through Eva like a knife. I tried to tell you, so many times. Eva's shoulders shook as she struggled to hold back tears. I was blind, Laya. I was selfish, and I let my work distract me. But I promise, I never let you down again. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. Laya nodded slowly, but her eyes held a weary sadness, as if she wasn't quite ready to trust her mother's promises. Over the following months, Eva and Laya's lives began to take on a new rhythm. Eva quit her boutique, realizing that no business was worth the price she had paid. Instead, she dedicated herself to her daughter, spending every waking moment ensuring Laya knew she was loved, heard, and safe. They would go for long walks together, share meals, and talk about Laya's day. Eva listened with a patience and attentiveness she had never shown before. Laya's therapy continued, and with each session, she grew a little stronger. She began to smile more, her laughter, though still faint, slowly returning. The nightmares that had once plagued her became less frequent, and in moments of silence, she felt the first flickers of peace. She was learning, day by day, that her life was more than the shadow of her father's actions. But the scars ran deep, and some days were harder than others. Sometimes, Laya would wake up crying, and Eva would hold her, stroking her hair and whispering that she was safe now. In those moments, they were both healing, mother and daughter, each carrying their own wounds, each learning to lean on the other. The day of Marco's trial arrived, casting a heavy shadow over their lives once again. Eva had dreaded this day, but she knew it was necessary for Laya to truly move forward. When Marco was brought in, Laya's heart pounded as she saw him sitting in the defendant's chair, his face cold and expressionless. She averted her gaze, clinging to Eva as her mother whispered, "You're safe, Laya. He can't hurt you anymore." The prosecutor laid out the evidence, recounting each heartbreaking detail of what Laya had endured. Eva wept quietly, and for the first time, she saw the horror of her daughter's pain laid bare for all to see. In the end, Marco was sentenced to life in prison, a verdict that brought a mixture of relief and sorrow to Eva and Laya. Justice had been served, but the scars he had left on their lives would take far longer to heal. The days after the trial marked the beginning of a new chapter for Laya and Eva. The weight of Marco's presence had lifted, and with it, they began to rebuild their lives. Eva had found a part-time job, allowing her to balance work while still prioritizing Laya. They sat together in the garden, watching butterflies flit among the flowers. Laya rested her head on Eva's shoulder, a gentle smile on her face. "Mommy," she said softly, "I think I'm going to be okay." Eva hugged her tightly, tears filling her eyes. "I know you will, Laya. And I'll be here, every step of the way." As they sat together, surrounded by the beauty of a new day, they felt hope blossom between them. Their bond, once fractured, was slowly mending, each day bringing them closer. Eva knew that she could never change the past, but she was committed to building a future where Laya would feel cherished, protected, and heard. And for Laya, that future was a promise of safety, love, and the chance to finally reclaim her childhood, one gentle moment at a time. The moral of this story is a powerful reminder of the importance of listening to and protecting children. It highlights several key lessons. Always listen to children. Children may not have the words to explain their pain, but their feelings and expressions should never be ignored. Ignoring or dismissing a child's attempts to share difficult or frightening experiences can leave them vulnerable and deepen their suffering. Be present and attentive as a parent. Success and work are important, but a child's safety and emotional well-being should always come first. Emotional absence, even with the best intentions, can lead to unintentional harm. Trust your intuition and investigate concerns. Eva's sister, Nina, sensed that something was wrong, and her persistence ultimately led to the truth being revealed. This teaches that intuition, especially when it involves a child's safety, should be trusted and acted upon. Ultimately, the story underscores that children's voices deserve to be heard and validated. Creating a safe, nurturing environment where children feel they can trust and communicate with their caregivers is essential for their well-being. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe. See you in the next video.